Hello and welcome to this new SAP S/4HANA Cloud Knowledge Snippet. In today's snippet, we will be going back to basics and looking at the authorizations concept that exists in SAP S/4HANA Cloud. Now, this is a topic that inevitably every customer that embraces SAP S/4HANA Cloud will need to go through, because you will need to ask yourselves the correct questions. In other words, what users are allowed to do what in my system? What data is it that these users are allowed to view? Which data is it that they are allowed to create or change? And even before that, what are the applications, what are the functions that I want them to be able to execute and have access to in the system? In other words, there could be one user that you want him to be able to create purchase orders, and another one you want him to be able to approve them. So this is what we will cover in today's knowledge snippet. But before we jump onto the system, let's cover some basics from a theory point of view so that you have the full picture of how the anatomy of the authorizations concept works within SAP S/4HANA Cloud. Now, the apps that we will be using in today's knowledge snippet are essentially the two that are highlighted there. So they are the maintain business users Fiori application, which is an application where you can, for a single user, add or remove roles that have been assigned to him. The other application that we will be focusing on mainly is the maintain business roles Fiori application. And this is essentially the application, the workhorse application, if you like, where you can create, you can change, you can copy or delete roles. You can also assign or delete catalogs to a given role. You can also then maintain the restrictions within a certain role. In other words, dictate what it is that they can view or create or change and at what level they can do this. You can also add users to a given role, just as you can remove users from a given role. And in case you are wondering, the role that you need to do these actions or have access to those Fiori apps is the SAP_BR_administrator role. And if you have this role assigned to you, then you will get the Fiori tile group identity and access management assigned to you and available. And that's where you will find those two Fiori applications. So let's dive right in. So when a user needs to interact with SAP S/4HANA Cloud, the first thing that he needs is, of course, a user ID and a password that he is obviously private and dedicated to him. And to that user, an administrator will have assigned a role or multiple roles. So within the context of best practices, we ship content with roles that is aligned to the best practices scope items that we provide to you in the cloud. There is nothing that prevents you from adopting those as they are or to tailor them to your own liking. By that, I mean that you might want to, for example, marry up two SAP template roles into one customized role. You could also, for example, decide to adopt the roles as they are. You could also do changes within these roles. So this is a choice that you have to think upon and really goes into your user management and authorization strategy. The one thing that I might add to this is that you need to be careful that you do not assign or try to combine too many roles into one, because then, of course, there is a very big likelihood that things will very quickly become unmanageable for you. Now, assigned to each role is a catalog or a set of catalogs. So one role can have one or multiple catalogs. And the catalogs is essentially going to drive the applications or the functions that the user has available to him in the SAP S/4HANA Cloud system. And by combining all of these elements, so when the user logs onto the SAP S/4HANA Cloud system, based on the roles that have been assigned to him, there is a certain set of catalogs assigned to the roles that will drive the applications, the reports, the functions that he's able to see and have access to when he logs onto the SAP S/4HANA Cloud system. So this is the premise, if you like, of the authorization concept here. This is dictating the applications or the actions that a user is going to be allowed to perform in the system. Moving on from that and delving in one level deeper. So again, we're now going to talk about maintaining those authorizations per se. In other words, how do I define that user X is allowed to only view or create and change data in the system, or both, of course, but also for at what level is he allowed to perform these actions? In other words, I am okay with a user viewing information in the system, irrespective of company, plant, organizational object, but I only want to allow him to create data in company code X, for example. So this is defined at the roles level by maintaining the restrictions. And the reason for why I have encapsulated this one role with the catalogs that are indicated there, so in effect, the catalogs that are assigned to this role, is because the restrictions are defined at the role level, not the catalog level. You cannot say that within this role, you want him to be able to create in company code X, but when he's leveraging an app that is in this catalog, he should be able to do so in company code Y. So again, the restrictions are maintained at the role level, not the catalog level. But of course, the restrictions that you do define will apply to a given catalog. So in terms of restrictions, and we'll get to that in the system, is that once you've assigned a role, you can maintain the restrictions. And the first thing that you have to decide upon when you maintain those restrictions is, when this user has this role, does he have view access to the information? So that's one possibility. And then the other possibility is, does he have create and change access with this role? So already you can understand that if I had, for example, a role, let's say a purchasing person, and if I wanted to have this person have access to the system in a viewing capacity only, so he could only view the data but not create or change it, then it means that I would need to have a role dedicated to that person or that position, where I would say he can view the data, but he cannot create or change it. Similarly, if in your organization you have a person that is, on top of viewing the data, allowed to create or change it, then it means that you need to create another role where you would define this particular access level. And within each one of these two options of viewing or creating amending data, you then have an additional functionality or capability, which is to say that they can either view, as an example, everything in the system or only a restricted set. Similarly, you could say, I only want this person to be able to create and change information in a very specific given company code, for example, or you could say that they're allowed to do creation or changes in any company code. And if you were to say that in terms of restrictions, I do want to restrict to a company code, for example, then as we'll see in the restrictions, you have to maintain the view access as being restricted, which then gives you access to a secondary panel of authorization objects, if you like, where you can say that this person with this role is allowed to create or change data in a restricted mode, and he can only create or change data in company code X and plant Y and for document type Z, for example. And of course, the authorizations will be different and contextual with regards to the role and catalog that you are trying to maintain these authorizations for. So that's on the theory side of things. So now we'll jump on to the system and see how this all works together. Okay, so we are now back in the S/4HANA Cloud system, and what we are currently looking at is my Fiori Launchpad, which is looking rather bare and empty. And the reason for that is because no roles have been assigned to my user as yet. This is to only make it easier for you guys to follow the purpose of this snippet, which is when I have an administrator that is going to be defining a role for me, as he defines the role and the authorizations, what impact that has on my user in terms of what I can do in the system. So that's what we'll be looking at. So my user will have the dark Fiori theme, but I am also using another user, which will be the administrator. And to more easily identify the administrator when I'm using it, I will be using the Fiori Light theme. I'll probably also, when I edit the video, add a caption somewhere just to make sure that, or at least to make it clearer that I'm using the administrator versus the user. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, as the administrator, define a new role for this user that has just, for example, joined the company, or this new position that has been created within our organization. And for the use case is going to be that I need to assign a purchasing type role to this person who is a purchasing officer. So by definition, that person should be able to create purchase orders, for example. Now we've gone through the fit to standard, we've looked at the great content that we provide, and we have identified that the SAP template role that we are going to use as a basis for creating this purchaser role is the SAP BR purchaser role. But before we do that, to create a role in S/4HANA Cloud, you essentially have three options, I would say. The first one is to create from scratch. So you really have a blank sheet of paper. You have to define which are the catalogs that you're going to assign to this role. The other option that you have is to copy. So for example, if you have a role that is somewhat close or near identical to the one that you want to create, then you can of course take that source role and copy it into a new one and then change whatever is specific to this new role that you are creating. It could be that you have just created a new company code and you have an existing role that you want to copy into this new company code and just change the authorizations around the company code that this role provides. What we are going to do is we are going to create a new role by leveraging a template. As I said, we've done the fit to standard. We've identified the scope items, the role that we want to use and assign to the user, or at least use as a starting point. And as you will no doubt have seen in all of the scope item documentation that we provide, the script documentation, we will always say that in order to execute these actions, you need to log on as role purchaser, for example, and you can create your own role by using the SAP template, SAP BR XYZ, whatever the role may be. So this is where the information then comes in really handy. So I'm going to create a new purchaser officer role by using this SAP BR purchaser role as a template. So to do that, I create I press the create from template button. And in the search help for template, you can see that we have all of the template roles that are proposed by default. I just want to narrow that down to purchase. Here we go. This is the role that I want, which is the SAP_BR purchaser. The next thing that you are going to do is you need to provide your own business role ID. In other words, this is the role ID, how it'll be identified in the list that is showing just behind me. So at the moment, it's enclosing it in this red box. And what it's trying to tell me is that this role, BR purchaser, is already existing in my system. So if I was to scroll down the list of roles that have already been created in the system, I would find BR Purchaser is there. Now I'm going to get rid of this and I'm going to use my own naming convention, and I'm going to call this ZPRE Purch Officer and 1010. Now, the reason I've indicated 1010 is because I will want to make this purchasing officer role specific to purchasing organization 1010. In other words, this person can create purchase orders for purchasing organization 1010. And what I'm trying to highlight here is that I would certainly encourage you as part of your architecture to think about how you are going to be identifying your roles in your system to easily and quickly understand what that role encapsulates. So for example, here I can already see that it's a purchasing officer role and it's for purchasing organization 1010. If I had just written BR purchaser, I would need to then go into the role to understand at a deeper level what authorizations this role is supposed to carry. So this is, of course, totally up to you how you want to structure the role ID, but I certainly encourage you to try and do something that will work for you. And then again, in the description, I'm going to call this Purchase Officer Purchase Organization 1010 as an example. Once you click OK, what then happens is that the role that you are creating then goes on to this creation window. And of course, some of the details that you've indicated are copied across, such as the role ID and description. You could also add some additional textual information. Whatever you want to put in there, it really is totally up to you. The other piece of information that is of great importance here is the template. And we can see here that this role was created from the template role SAP BR Purchaser. And this will be very important when you need to realign your custom roles with SAP template roles. And there is a separate Fiori app that allows you to identify how you have digressed from the SAP template roles. And you, of course, then have an automatic capability of realigning your custom roles with the template roles, which of course is also something that's very useful in the case of upgrades. Now, going back to our role that we are currently creating, the next piece of information that we are finding here is the assigned business catalogs. And as I said earlier on, the role is associated to catalogs, and a catalog drives the applications or functions that the user will get to see. Now, if we wanted to, for example, drill into one of these catalogs, so we'll find materials management purchase orders, which is the catalog that has the technical ID that's indicated there, and I click on this particular catalog, I can then further drill down and under the applications, see exactly which are the Fiori applications that this catalog drives. So by simply assigning this role, I have a certain number of catalogs that were copied or assigned to my role, and I'm also getting the benefit of having then those applications via those catalogs directly accessible to my user. One thing to note is that you cannot change the catalog content. So if you were to say, well, I don't want to give the redistribute workload application to this particular user, I cannot do it. Okay, a catalog, it is what it is, and it comes with a logical grouping of applications. So I'm now going to go back to my business role with all the catalogs defined. The other thing that we can see here is that we can see that all of these catalogs have a read access that is unrestricted, which means that this user can via the applications assigned to this catalog, view all the data that is in the system, irrespective of company code, plant, cost center, purchasing organization, or whatever it is that is applicable to the apps that are afforded to me via these catalogs, and hence this role. However, the write access says no access, which means that I cannot create information. So if I was to simply assign this role to my user, I would not be able to create purchase orders. So at this point in time, we'll leave it as it is. We're not going to maintain any additional restrictions or authorizations on this particular role. All I'm going to do is I'm going to assign it to my user. So here's my user. I'm just going to say OK, so that my user is now going to have this role. But we're not quite there yet, because we can see that the life cycle is in preparation. Now, it could also be that creating a role or crafting a role for a user is something that's going to take you a little bit of time, which is of course something that you can do. So you would have, for example, the option of just saving your work at this point in time, so you don't lose all of the work that you've done so far, and do whatever it is that you have to do. You come back later in the day and then you finish off, pick up your role, and then once you're ready, you can activate it. And it's only once it's activated that the role is usable, visible to the users to which it has been assigned. Okay, so the changes have been saved. So to recap where we're at, we've created a purchase officer role. We have not maintained any restrictions onto it. We've just taken the standard, which is that I can view anything but not create or change anything. And I have assigned it to my user, and the status is active. So I'm now going to go back to my standard user, and I'm going to refresh the browser window. So I can now see all of the applications that were associated to the catalogs that were associated to the role that I've assigned to my user appear in my Fiori Launchpad. So let's go ahead and try to create a purchase order. So we'll go to Purchase Order Processing, Manage Purchase Orders. And if you recall, the role had unlimited view access. So if I just click on Go, I should be able to see purchase order information, which I can see coming here. If I click on one of these purchase orders, then I am also able to view this particular purchase order. Let's go back. And now I'm going to try and create a purchase order. So at this point in time, you might be wondering and asking yourself, well, if we had indicated no access or kept the default no access for create and change, why is it that I have access to the ability to go into create purchase order? So the reason for that is very simple, which is that by simply assigning the role that drives the catalogs, that drives the applications, I'm in effect giving the user the start authorization to start the application, which is why I can go into it. Where things are hopefully going to start to get a little bit crusty is when I start to input the information in the purchase order, and hopefully at this point in time, the system will start to say, whoa, you don't have the access to do that. I'm not going to let you do it. So let's go ahead and try and find a supplier. And we are going to go with the standard domestic supplier 1. And already here you can see that, so I'm getting this red bound box around the purchasing organization. I also have the indicator that messages have appeared. So let's go ahead and click on that 3. So the system is telling me that the PO header is faulty. And here's something that we wanted to find, which is the missing authorization. So if I go into that particular message, it tells me missing authorization, purchase order, create purchase org 1710. So based on the supply that I selected, the system automatically then picked up the company code and the purchasing organization as well as the purchasing group. But the system is telling me, no, that's not going to happen because you do not have the authorization to be able to create a purchase order in this purchasing organization, which is exactly what we wanted to see. So I'm just going to say cancel, and I'm going to discard the draft, and we'll go back to the Fiori Launchpad with the user. So now we'll flip back to the administrator, and we are going to change the role that is assigned to my user and give him the required authorizations to be able to create that purchase order in that purchasing organization. So let's go ahead into it. So we're back at where we were when we created the role initially. The catalogs, of course, are all still assigned to my role, but now what we want to do is we want to go and maintain restrictions. So by default, whenever you create a role in S/4HANA Cloud, the read authorizations will be unrestricted, which means that the user can view, can read all the information in the system, provided the role, the catalogs that are assigned to him allow him to have this access. So in this particular case, as we've seen, I was able to read the purchase order information that was already in the system, and I didn't need to maintain any authorizations to do that or not. However, I could not create a purchase order because from a write point of view, I have no access. So the write encapsulates both the create and the change modes. So on the basis of these two restrictions, you can already understand that if you wanted to have this purchasing officer org position in your organization, and some people were only allowed to read the data and others were allowed to create and change the data, then that would already imply that you need to create two roles. One that would only have read access to the information, but no access to creating or changing information, so no write access. And then the other role where they would, of course, have the read access as well as the write access in order to be able to create purchase orders. So already here, this drives the need to create two roles, one where they would only be able to read and the other one where they could actually create and change information. So I'm not going to maintain, or rather the ability, the possibilities that are afforded to you is that in terms of write, so creating data, you can be also in unrestricted mode, which means that you can create purchase orders, to take this example, in any company code that exists in your system, in any purchasing organization, any plant, any purchasing group, as the name implies, with no restrictions whatsoever, which is usually something that you do not want to see happening in an organization. So what you then need to do is you need to go to restricted. And once you've selected restricted, this is when you have these options that now come up where you can define what the scope of these restrictions are. So remember that what we want to do is we want to allow my user to be able to create purchase orders in Purchasing Organization 1710, Company Code 1710. So we need to define those authorizations. So going down in the list of relevant and applicable authorizations that I can set, I will do so. So the first thing that I can set is the purchasing group. So I'm going to click on that little edit button. And the system tells me, well, these are the purchasing groups that are available in your system. For which one would you like to allow this user to create purchase orders? And you have two options. You could, of course, say unrestricted access. And that would mean that for any purchasing group, that person can create a purchase order. You can also have ranges. So you could say that from purchasing group 1 to purchasing group 3, which would of course include 2 as well, then this person can create purchase orders. and you can have several ranges, of course. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say that he can only create purchase orders for purchasing group 005. So this value is then copied into the restrictions of this role. Moving on, the next item that is of relevance is the plant. So I'm going to say that he can add items in purchase orders that are for plant 1710. The next thing that I want to add is the purchasing organization. I'm going to say 1710. And similarly with the company code, I am, now as you can see here, I have several company codes that exist. And just to illustrate the unrestricted ability, I'm just going to say unrestricted. So I could potentially create a purchase order in any one of these company codes that exist in my system. So if I say unrestricted access, I do get a warning to say, are you sure this is what you want to do, to allow this person to do in unrestricted access for all these company codes? I'm just going to say yes. And we'll see that this then comes up as a star unrestricted in the authorizations. You could, of course, maintain the other settings that are available, but they are not necessarily relevant for what we are trying to do, which is the maintenance, the creation of purchase orders. So I'm just going to say, go back to the main page. Now, as a result of having changed this particular role, I have gone back from active to in preparation. So once again, to make these changes come into effect, I'm going to say activate. Here we go, the changes have been saved. The role is back to being active. So again, I'm going to flip back to my user. I'm going to once again refresh my browser window to take into account the changes I've just made to it. And once again, I'm going to go to purchase order processing. I'm going to manage purchase orders. And try to create a purchase order. As before, I'm going to select the same supplier that will determine the same organizational levels. And again, I'm getting some messages. And if you recall previously, we were getting the red bounded box around the purchasing organization, which we are not getting anymore. And this is because, of course, in the authorizations, we've maintained the ability for this user to create purchase orders in this particular purchasing organization. So if we go and look at the messages that have been identified, again, I'm getting a PO header faulty information and a missing authorization. And this time the system is telling me that I don't have the authorization to access the purchasing group 001. And if you recall, the reason for that is because we only authorized them for purchasing group 005. So there we go. I've added the purchasing group 005, which is the one that I'm allowed to use when I create purchase orders. And at this point in time, we have no more error messages. So if I then go on to add an item, so we'll pick RM09. We'll give it a quantity of 1. So I'll now click on order, and I should have a purchase order number. There we go. The system says purchase order has been saved, a number has been assigned to it. It's currently in approval. So there you go. We have seen the steps that were needed to allow my user to carry out certain activities in the system, but also restrict him to doing these activities within very targeted, confined organizational levels that I've dictated that this person was allowed to have. I'm just going to go back to the Fiori Launchpad for my user, and I'm now going to go back to the role from an administrator point of view. The last thing I want to show you is if we go to maintain restrictions, you can see that there are a certain number of restrictions that have been made available to the restrictions maintenance in this particular role. And this, of course, is driven by the catalogs that are assigned to this role. So what I'm going to do is, as an example, I'm going to delete all of the catalogs that are part of this role, but the only thing that I'm going to keep is the ability to maintain purchase orders. So let's go to material management purchase orders. So I've selected all the catalogs and deselected the one for management of purchase orders. So I'm going to remove all the ones that were selected and remove them from this particular role. Again, because I've altered this role, we can see that the lifecycle status has gone to in preparation. Once again, I will activate it, which will do the save and activation at the same time. There we go. And if we again go into the maintain restrictions, so there we go. As a result of removing a certain number of catalogs from this role, when I go to maintain restrictions, you can see that the restrictions are now drastically reduced because the system has removed the ones that were applicable to apps that are in catalogs that I have now removed. So let's go back one step. The role is active. I will now flip back to my user once again. And if we look at the Fiori tile groups that he's got access to, I'm going to refresh that. As a result of having removed certain catalogs from the role, I should also have a reduced list of Fiori tile groups and Fiori applications. So there we go. We can see that I'm only left with the purchase order processing, and even within the purchase order processing Fiori tile group, the apps that I have access to has been reduced. So just before we close off this snippet, the last thing that I wanted to show you, which I believe I've omitted from doing previously, is that when you are in the role maintaining the restrictions that we maintained whilst we were here in the write mode could just as easily be maintained in the read mode. In other words, you could say that a user is only allowed to view information, but be more specific about it and say that he can only view information in company code X, for example, or purchasing group Y as another example. Then the last thing that I want to also highlight is that this is somewhat invisible to you, but in the back end, this purchasing group is linked to an authorization object. And what I would like to make sure that you also understand is that this purchasing group field could potentially be used in the context of another catalog in a different role. And at the time of accessing an application, the system is just going to look at the authorizations that have been given to this particular authorization object. So do not think that the purchasing group that you might indicate in this particular role is only applicable to this role. Because as I said, at the end of the day, this authorization object, there is only one in the system and can be used in multiple roles. So if you have a role where you've said that the purchasing group authorization is 001, and in another role, you've indicated that the authorization for purchasing group is 002, what you are in effect saying is that from a system-wide point of view, the user will have access to purchasing group 001 and 002. Okay, you do have to understand that it is not just applicable to the role in which this is used. Okay, so there's one piece of wisdom that is important that you should partake. It is probably that. Then the next thing I want to show you is the ability to download the roles and then take them across into your production system, because of course the good and best practice is that you define these roles in your test system, you test them in your test system to make sure that the users that you want to be able to do things are able to do those things in the test system. And similarly, you also want to test and make sure that what they should not be able to do, they indeed cannot do it in the system. But of course, we don't want you to do the work twice. In other words, it's not productive for you to be doing these roles and testing them in the Q system, in the test system, and then again doing that in the P system. So within the maintain business roles application, there is a nifty functionality that allows you to very specifically download the roles that you might have defined in your test system and then upload them into your P system. So in this particular case, I'm going to take my role that I've just defined and I'm going to download it. And what this does is it generates this XML file. So let's go and find this file. I'm just going to put it up here in my desktop. And I'm not going to, excuse me, alter this file at all. I'm just going to leave it there sitting on my desktop. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this particular role from my system. So I'm essentially mimicking that I am now in my P system and I need to upload, in other words, create the role that I have just downloaded from my test system. So in this case, I go to the upload button. I need to go and find this business role file, which is in my desktop business role, open, and I'm going to say OK. The system tells me, okay, this is the business role that we're about to upload. Now it's showing me one because I only downloaded one from my test system, but potentially I could have a certain number of those that I would want to bring into my P system, or selectively go about, just selecting the ones that I did want to upload in my P system. I'm going to say okay. And if I now once again look for that ZPRE role, voila, there it is in my system once again. It's in preparation, so I would just need to finalize, in this case, assign the users, activate this role, and my users would, hey presto, be able to create purchase orders. I'm just going to activate this one. And there we go. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to this YouTube channel for more content. We hope to see you soon.